enjoy having you, and looking forward to the class tonight. So let me go ahead and get started with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. All right, so I want to welcome everybody in here today for chapter 41 of Isaiah. My name is Steve Sheik. I'm the congregation leader, rabbi, whatever else needs to be done kind of guy at Tree of Life Messianic Congregation in Katy, Texas. And so with that introduction, I've said all I need to say about that, and let's get into it. All right, we are in here now in this part of the book of Isaiah, the deliverance of God's people. And then we run through here's all of the, the 3 slides of the important dates that are involved in the book of Isaiah. And so right now we're still talking around 700 BCE, that time frame there, but and from here on out, Isaiah is talking about events far in the future. So the timeline, it's a little hard to nail down the timeline. Last week we were way over here because that's where he was, what Isaiah was talking about. But in reality, we should probably be it could very well be somewhere in there, but because he was talking about where the temple was destroyed and all that. Well, now he's actually talking further in the future, back maybe when Israel will be able to return. He's going to be talking about Cyrus and how that the prophecy of Cyrus, 100 years before the guy was even born. So that's where we'll be. So are there any questions before we get started tonight? And like I said, if you do have comments or questions, all you got to do is unmute yourself and say away, and we can make it just as reactive as as you want to make it. And that helps me, because when you ask questions, that gives me a chance to get a drink of water. All right, so here we go. Now, this unit that we're talking about here tonight is based on making sure that Israel, it's to assure Israel that God had both the power, he can do it, and the desire he wants to do. He wants to deliver her, and bring salvation not only to Israel, but to the whole world. And so it contains 3 basic themes: the Gentiles or pagan, however you want to say that, the non-Jewish folks, inability to refute God's sovereignty, the promise to deliver a fearful Israel, Judah at this point, and the divine plan to use an ideal servant as a redeemer. So that's going to get a little bit beyond our chapter that we're going to do tonight, but that's where we're headed. And so the Lord, through his prophet Isaiah, assured Israel in this segment of our text that Israel need not fear the nations. That's verses 1-7. Because Adonai remained committed to his people, and he would use them to accomplish his purposes in the world. And that, of course, is in verses 8-20. And so this is an expression of God's grace, and it would have encouraged and motivated the Israelites to serve God. All right, so in the first 7 verses, what we have here is almost kind of like a courtroom setting. where God is calling people up to be witnesses and so forth. So in verses 1 to 4, that it has enabled Isaiah to make God's power, his transcendent monotheism, very clear and compelling. And verse 1 is a call to judgment, and verses 2 to 4 set forth God's case, namely his acts in history. He's doing a history lesson for these folks. So let's read. With all that said, let me read verse 1. Be silent before me, O islands. Let peoples renew their strength. Let them draw near. Let them speak. Let us come together for judgment. So, when they're talking about, O islands, what that does, it connotates a lot of people wanting to get in. It connotates the farthest reaches of the Gentile world, that the nations that bordered the seas. And you got to remember that back in those days, the Israelites were not a seafaring people. They looked at the Mediterranean Ocean as the home of well, they call it the deep, and that's where the Leviathan was, and it was a horrible place. And so they were pretty much scared to death at this time in history of going out on the Mediterranean. They were not like the Phoenicians. And so so we're talking about the farthest reaches of the world here, and not just islands, but basically, the ends of the earth is what we're talking about here. And in chapter 40, here Isaiah God through Isaiah saying he wants the Jewish people, or the Gentile world, to listen up. He's got something to say, and he wants the Gentile world to listen up here. And so in chapter 40, Isaiah spoke of God in the third person, but in this chapter, it's God himself that's speaking, and Isaiah is just a scribe. He's writing it down. Now, you'll see this oscillation in chapters that follow too, where God says something, he'll say directly, and then other times Isaiah saying, well, God said, and then he'll go back to where it's he's quoting directly, God is speaking directly. So the Gentiles were to be fellow heirs with Israel, even as far back there. That was the plan. And you'll see, we saw that in chapter 19, verses 24 to 25, and then also in chapter 27, verse 13. But before that could happen, the Gentile world had to meet with the Lord and arrive at a decision. They had to make a decision there. So anyway, the words are addressed to the whole Gentile world, everything. And first of all, to the inhabitants of the western islands and coast. Okay, where would that be? That would be up around, maybe that would be Turkey and over into Greece and those places like that, the places that they knew. And but basically it's to all of the world. Okay, so but the Gentiles, if they're gonna be part of be an heir with Israel, they had to follow the Lord, and so they had decisions to make. Verses 2 to 3. Who has stirred up one from the east? He calls justice to his feet and gives nations over to him and subdues kings. He makes them like dust with his sword, as driven stubble with his bow. He pursues them, passing on safely by a path his feet had not traveled. All right. So, so the Lord is asking the nations a question. See, he said, who had righteously summoned a conqueror from the east who would come and defeat nations and overcome kings as easily and swiftly as one blows away dust and chaff? Later on, Isaiah would identify this conqueror as Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus the Persian, Cyrus the Great, whatever. But here the emphasis is on not on Cyrus, but the one who called Cyrus, and that is God Almighty, Adonai. All right, so the there were 4 Mesopotamian kings who invaded Canaan in Abraham's day. You remember those? Remember that story? And they took Lot captive, and they were prototypes of this invader, as were, later on we had Sargon, Sennacherib, Nebuchadnezzar, and ultimately Yeshua will be that ultimate fulfillment of this passage when he returns to the east, to the earth east of Jerusalem. That's up on the Mount of Olives, actually, and overcomes the enemies who will have been assembled in Palestine, in the environs around Jerusalem. I even hesitate to use the word Palestine because it's Israel. But anyway, Cyrus came from Persia, which is modern Iran, and which is, west of Mesopotamia, east of Mesopotamia. And so this invader would proceed safely over previously unused routes. Remember, before they would follow the Euphrates up and over, and like get to Haran, and then down along the coast, and that's the way that all of the invaders would come. Cyrus didn't do that way. So, but the emphasis here is that it's not Cyrus, it's God who orchestrates everything. And so I'm going to turn that one off. Maybe that'll be better. Okay. All right. So going on to verse 4. Who has performed and done it, calling forth the generations from the beginning? I, Adonai, am the first and the last. I am he. So in here, it's always been, the Lord has always been the one who has called forth such conquerors to carry out his will in the world. The military history of the world is simply the manifestation, the outworking of God's sovereign plan. The historian theologian A.T. Pearson used to say that history is his story. If you get that. Okay, it only works in English. God is the ultimate strategist who he controls all of history. It's always been so, and it will always be so, because no other God preceded Adonai, and neither will any other succeed him. He has no beginning, no end. He's, that he is the beginning. He says, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, or actually the Aleph and the Tav, and beginning to the end. And but with God there is no end, and there really wasn't any beginning either. But infinity like that is kind of a hard concept to nail down. We found that out in our Torah class on Shabbat, that infinity is a little bit tough to really define. So in anyway, that when he says at the end of the verse, there is anihu, meaning I am he. That says it all. I'm the man. I am the one. And so that is I always thought that was a pretty good way of saying it. I am he. And really nothing else to say on that in identifying the Lord. All right, so in verses 5 to 6, the coastlands have seen and fear, the ends of the earth tremble, they draw near and come. Each one helps his neighbor and says to his brother, be strong. So verses 5 to 7, we only did 5 and 6 here, but 5 to 7, they kind of relate the response of the Gentile nations to the preceding questions that God had posed. So rather than submitting to the one true God, the Gentile world, the pagans, typically would seek help from what? From idols. Let me shift that page. All right. And so hearing this message of the Lord's sovereignty, the nations, according to Isaiah, there will fear, and they will try to encourage each other. You know, what else would they do? Because they're not going to go, they're not relying on the Lord, so they're just trying to encourage each other. They're not going to bow before the Lord, and but they'll get together with each other and just be scared and tell the other guy, well, you know, suck it up, buttercup. Let's not be afraid. But that's not the way it's going to work. The verse 7, the craftsman encourages the smith, who smooths with the hammer, who strikes with the anvil, saying of the soldering, it's good, as he fastens it with nails so that it will not totter. All right. As well as encouraging each other, they will then build idols. And rather than turning to the Lord, they will make gods to whom they can turn. And that's just kind of silly, but that's what they did. And in chapter 40, go back to chapter 40 and verse 18 to 20, Isaiah contrasted the idols, if you remember that, he contrasted the idols with the God of creation. And but here now, he contrasted them with the God of history. And it's not these idols who strengthen their worshipers, but actually it's the worshipers who strengthen their idols. And the idols have no power of their own at all. So you can imagine, okay, what kind of God would that be when you have to have some dude in a factory or in a workshop, silversmith shop, or whatever kind of shop it is that's fashioning these idols, that you have to have a supervisor in there saying, yep, that passes inspection, and he's good to go. And so, you know, here's a supervisor saying, oh yeah, the little idol that you have, yeah, it looks good. I don't see any defects on it. So now your God is good to go. And what kind of a God is that? My word. Yeah, Warren said at the time, if you want, pull the chat up. I encourage everybody to go ahead and pull the chat up, and so that you can see it as it's going by. And yeah, God is outside of time and space. You know, there's just no way of defining him within time and space. So defining eternity and infinity, you know, that you can't define God with those terms, because he's even greater than all of that. So, so the prophet may want to, I mean, you know, this verse here, not all that clear, but the prophet may want to basically heighten the irony of showing, you know, what a complex and arduous task idol making is. And, you know, it's got to be just right and everything. But then then God, then the worker then has to have it approved before they can declare, okay, yeah, this is your God now. How silly. But anyway, that's what they would do. And verses 8-9. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, descendant of Abraham, my friend, I took hold of you from the ends of the earth and called from its uttermost parts and said to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you, not rejected you. So, whereas verses 1-7, it's a prophecy. It's more like a near prophecy. Okay, even though it's 100 years from then. That's near prophecy in the terms of God's time scale here. He's talking about the prophecy of Cyrus. And then verses 8-20, they speak of a far distant prophecy of Israel's final deliverance. And so regardless of whether the nations, their refusal to acknowledge the Lord, he will intervene in history for the welfare of his chosen people, his fearful servant Israel. So Israel did not need to fear like the nations, because why? The Lord would be with his chosen people and he would protect them. So the Lord turned, he turned from addressing the nations to now he's speaking to Israel. And he had chosen Israelites for a special blessing. And so this election of Israel rests on love. And you can see that in Deuteronomy 7. And the reference to Jacob, then, it looks back to the unworthiness of the Israelites. Remember that, Jacob was not the most sterling of characters, but he's in our one of our patriarchs. And so the the mention of Abraham then recalls the fact that Abraham loved God. So the proper response to and that's the proper response to electing love. Both references also connect to God's covenant with the patriarchs. So God had called Israel to be a servant, and this is the first of, I think, 31 references to the servant of the Lord in Isaiah. It's not always talking about Israel. It's talking about the Messiah too. God reminded his people that he had called them from the remotest parts of the earth to be his servant. He did this in Abraham's case when he called him out of Ur into the promised land. He did it in Jacob's case when he brought him back into the land from his time, that 20 years that he spent up in Haran. And so God had determined that he was not going to reject his people. And so therefore, Israel had nothing to fear. If he didn't reject them during that 40 years in the wilderness after Egypt, then, he's not going to reject them. So Isaiah wrote of three servants of the Lord: the whole nation of Israel, the faithful remnant of Jews within that nation, and the Messiah. And so the context of where he wrote that will allow us to identify which servant is in view in each reference. Sort of. But sometimes when they're talking about the servant, it depends on whether you're a believer in Yeshua or you're not. And so we'll try to, as the course goes on, we'll try to unravel some of that. So verse 10. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. So Israel, they did not need to fear because God was with them, and he had committed himself to them. They didn't need to look one way or than the other to try to find safety. Certainly they didn't need to rely on alliances with other nations. Furthermore, their God promised to help them in every way with his powerful right hand. Now, that's always been a symbol, that the right hand, it's a symbol of strength, and to doing what is right. And no exiled nation had ever before in history been brought back to start life brand new in their ancestral homeland. And even though the Gentile government would have really no practical means of inducing the Jews to return home, God brought them back. It's kind of miraculous then that he brought some of them back. In fact, he didn't bring back a lot. 20% of the people that went into the Babylonian exile came back to Israel. Why? Because actually life in Babylon was more lucrative and more comfortable than it was back in Israel, where they had to contend with enemies and animals and all sorts of stuff. And so, but God had a purpose in that too, with the people that stayed in Babylon. That's where we get the Babylonian Talmud and a lot of writings and a lot of critical thinking from that time frame. Verse 11, behold, all who are angry at you will be ashamed and disgraced. Those who quarrel with you will be as nothing and perish. Though you will look for those who contended with you, you will not find them. Those who warred against you will be as nothing at all. Now, this behold here, when you have a behold, you're supposed to behold. It's pay attention. And so it says that there's more promises to come. So the rage or the anger that Israel's enemies had against her would really prove to be just shameful against these enemies. Their claims against Israel would really come to nothing. Israel's opponents would vanish, and her enemies would cease to exist. Now, increasing opposition would only become more increasingly ineffective, in fact. So these nations that would mess around with God's servant would have to contend with the almighty, powerful master, the Lord himself. So they didn't really have anything that they needed to worry about with the other nations. And so you look back at history now, and all of these empires and nations that had oppressed Israel over the years, where are they now? There is no more Egypt is a poor country in the Mediterranean. Rome, the Roman Empire, is busted up into numerous nations, and so it's no longer an empire. The Greek Empire is the same thing, certainly with Assyria, Babylonian Empire. You just go and name all of the different ones. They're all gone, and only Israel remains. And so as an entity, those others, you can find little remnants of them. Egypt is still there, and the city of Rome is still there. The countries are still there, but that influence, that imperial reach that they had, they're all gone, and Israel is still there. They're still speaking their same language. All right, so For I am Adonai, your God, who upholds your right hand and who says to you, fear not, I will help you. Fear not, you worm Jacob, you men of Israel, I will help you. It is a declaration of Adonai, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. All right, now, God restated his promise and his exhortation from verse 10. So Israel's God would strengthen, encourage, and help his people. He would stand with them while he defended them, because why? He was Adonai Tzvaot, their God. All right. So then the Lord employed a second picture to comfort the Israelites. He would enable what was essentially weak. Now, when I read this thing first, I thought he's calling Jacob a worm. Okay, and let me get onto that. Okay, Rolf had a question. It says the Talmud here is not to derail tonight. The Talmud was written between it was finished around 700 AD, but the seeds, the birth seeds, the seeds of all of that thought and the schools and the of all that started during the Babylonian exile, and a lot of things that caused Israel Judaism to survive to where it has today are because of the things that were started in Babylon. And so during the Babylonian Empire, the synagogue system that they have, the Beit Din, the Beit Tefillah, the house of prayer, and so forth, those concepts of Judaism on the local level in each village and each town was a new concept. It was kind of decentralized Judaism to where it would work. And as a result, then idolatry was never, ever again a problem after the Babylonian exile, and the system changed. And the Talmud started writing, of course, with the Mishnah from around 200 AD, because they could see that the Romans were having a pretty good success of killing off a lot of their scholars. And so they said, well, we better start writing this stuff down. So they started writing with the Mishnah. And then after the Mishnah was done around 200 AD, then they started working on because the Mishnah was a commentary on the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And then, well, that wasn't quite enough. So then they would then they started with the Gemara, which was a commentary on the Mishnah, as well as the Torah. And then from there, they've completed that around 600 or 700 AD. And then from there, we had still the writings of a lot of the sages down throughout history. So that's the Cliff Notes version of all of that. Did I get it right, Tim?
Yes, sorry, I had to unmute. I thought you could see my thumbs up, but yes.
No, I don't have all of that. I don't have everybody's picture up there because I can't see all my screens if I do that.
Yeah, it was cool digging. I like it.
All right. So anyway, let's go ahead. But the idea of the worm. Now, I don't know if anybody looked at that and thought, why is God calling Jacob a worm? Did that get anybody's attention? I don't know. Am I the only one that's kind of it kind of surprised me? Well, not surprised me because I'd read it before, but I'd looked at it and thought, why is God calling Jacob a worm? And that's like one of those old one of those Christian hymns or something. And I can't even remember the hymn now, but it says, as such a worm as I. Well, you know what? I'm not a worm. God did not send his son to die for a worm. I'm a valued human being to him. But anyway, so the idea of the worm, well, it's in contrast. Okay. A worm is a very small, insignificant thing in the garden. It can be anyway. In my garden, there are worms out there that I cannot see without magnification. In some cases, I cannot see them without like a microscope. And in other cases, like the other day, there were worms that were eating on my tomato plants, and they were about this long and about this big around, and they called it tomato hornworm. And so, but anyway, in the scheme of things, a worm is kind of a small, insignificant thing. And so here God is saying, okay, Jacob, you're just small, insignificant. Israel is small, insignificant, but you're my people. And so we look then at verse 15, said, yeah, those tomato hornworms are small, but boy, they're powerful. And then the nematodes, they're tiny worms too, and they destroyed an okra crop that I had a couple of years ago. But anyway, going ahead, verse 15, look, I will make you a threshing sledge, new with sharp double-edged spikes. You will thresh the mountains and grind them up, and I will make the hills like chaff. You will winnow them, and a wind will carry them away. A storm wind will scatter them, but you will rejoice in Adonai. You will glory in the Holy One of Israel. So the Lord would transform. Okay, now I wanted to show you what he's going to transform this little helpless worm, a tiny, the worms, earthworms. They get in the soil and they work their way through there, and it's good to have earthworms in your soil because they help keep it healthy and so forth. They're kind of threshers of the soil, and but he's going to turn Israel into a threshing sledge, mighty, powerful threshing sledge, and giving her his power.
I have a comment right here in the scheme of things. Don't turn that to me. In the scheme of things, we are like worms. In the whole of creation, we are so seemingly insignificant, so small. But the 12 disciples, when they completely turn their lives over to God in obedience and depending upon him, they changed the world.
There you go. The Rebetson has spoken.
There's also something very interesting about the worm, the earthworm.
Yeah.
You pick it up and it just kind of flops. But where is the power of the earthworm? It's in its mouth, which is why it can do so much in changing the structure of the soil and loosening the soil and all these different things. So we can look at that as though we are weak vessels, but when we open our mouths and speak, that's where great power comes from, when we're speaking the word of Hashem.
Good point. Good point. I didn't know if people knew what a threshing sledge was. But here's the bottom side of this thing here. And you'll see that they got rocks stuck in there. Now, how they got them stuck in there, I don't know. But anyway, they got these rocks stuck in there. And here's a guy on some kind of a threshing sledge, and they're just kind of walking it around in a circle and processing the grain. And then after they get that all done, they do the winnowing, where that's what the word is talking about there. They'll throw the chaff up, or throw the whole mess up in a high wind, and it blows away, and then the grain falls down to the earth, but then all of the other stuff blows away. So anyway, it was not easy work making bread. I mean, just the grinding of the bread, that's kind of the, the end result. But just getting, I've looked at growing my own wheat and oats and rye and barley and stuff out here, and got to looking at all how hard that is to work. And I thought, well, I don't have time to do that. I don't have the equipment to do that. And it's a lot of work. I can go to the grocery store and buy a loaf of bread. But it's something that they had to do back in those days. So that tiny worm thresher would become powerful, and these the farmers dragged this stuff over the straw to cut it up in preparation for the winnowing. When they throw it up in the air and the wind would blow the chaff away. I guess, and then he says, but not only are you going to be doing that in a threshing floor, you're going to be doing it to the hills and the mountains and everything. So that I guess a modern equivalent would be giant earth moving equipment. And you can see that, you can see it in this country. You can see it in certainly in Israel, where they've transformed some of the hilly places into just wonderful farmland. So, but this sledge would do more than that. It would winnow the nations as well as threshing them. That strong wind that God would provide would drive Israel's enemies away, like the wind separated the wheat from the chaff and blew the chaff away. So all of the hindrances to God's ultimate purposes in the international scheme of things is it's going to be overcome through a judgment executed through Israel. And you see that in Micah 4, 10 to 13. So Israel would then rejoice and make her boast in her great God, who had both empowered her and removed her enemies. We'll see that in the future. The poor and the needy ask for water, but there is none. The tongues are parched with thirst. I, Adonai, will answer them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will open rivers in the bare hills and springs in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and a dry land, and the dry land into fountains of water. So, at the time that Isaiah is writing, you'd say that Israel was kind of in a drought condition. Okay, like we are here in Texas, we're kind of in a drought condition. Things are dry. You walk out on the grass and it crunches underneath your feet because it's dried up. But the Lord promised to bring his people into a paradise-like existence. So the third picture here unfolds in verse 17. It's like Israel is thirsting in the wilderness, and the Lord promised to answer the prayers of his crushed and helpless people, and he's going to answer it himself. He's not going to send a messenger. He says he's going to do it himself. He promised to come to their aid and not forsake them. Why? Because he was their God. And whenever you see the words poor and needy used together in Isaiah, it's always a reference to that faithful remnant of Israel. And so verse 18, the Lord would provide by making, some kind of innovation. He was going to bring water where there was none, where they wouldn't see any water. He's going to bring it to them. There's going to be springs that will come up. And, that's something that God can do. He can make that water just work its way to wherever he wants it. And then modern technology now, or he's given people the ability to bring water. And so these deserts of Israel are now flourishing, just a breadbasket of all sorts of produce. Several years ago, when the BDS movement was going on and trying to punish Israel by the European nations. And they said, we're not going to buy anything from Israel. And then they, after that started a little bit, then they realized that, oh no, we get too much stuff from Israel. All of these things that we've gotten used to, the fruits and the vegetables and everything that's so good, they're coming from Israel. Okay, so let's back off of the BDS. And so it was kind of comical to see. All right. Verse 19. I will plant in the wilderness the cedar, the acacia tree, the myrtle, and the olive tree. I will set in the desert the cypress tree and the pine together with the box tree, so they may see and know, consider and understand together that the hand of Adonai has done this. The Holy One of Israel has created it. All right. So he would also provide all of the other necessities that they would need in the wilderness to survive. And mainly, besides water, you can have water, but man, live, it's going to be very, very uncomfortable if you don't have any shade. And so all of the trees, there were 7 of them mentioned there. They're all, they're shade trees of a sort. And then you have the olives, of course, that's going to have something that would provide income and food. But these normally did not grow together, and in some cases they could not grow in a desert at all. And so this just kind of enhances the picture that God is working wonders in the natural world to provide for his people. And that number of 7 of the trees may symbolize the complete perfection of God's work in this connection. So this and also the water and the trees and the 7, and it may kind of again point back a little bit to the a return to the Garden of Eden like conditions. And the 7, of course, they talk about the 7 species that we talk about during the Feast of Sukkot. Is another 7 that's involving food and provision for Israel. The Lord would do this also, or he'd do this so that the afflicted and the needy, his people, would reflect and then learn that their God had done a powerful creative work for them. So the righteous God of verses verse of 8:13 back in going back to that, and the Redeemer here of verses 14 through 17 is now the Creator, and he's transforming, he's rearranging his creation for the benefit of his needy ones. All right, so this is definitely showing God's intervention in the lives of his people. Okay, says, present your case, says Adonai. Bring forth your reasons, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring forth and tell us what will happen. The former things, what were they? Tell us that we may consider them and know that their outcome, or announce to us things to come. So we kind of shifted back now to the courtroom. And so how is it that the Lord and not other objects of worship direct world history? The Lord alone can predict the future and then bring it to pass. The court case with the nations, we began that at verse 1 through 4. It's interrupted then by the assurance to God's people that he was going to take care of them. Well, now we're back into the courtroom, and before it ends, the Lord will explain the ministry of his servant Messiah, and that's going to be in as we get into chapter 42. The emphasis here on verses 21 and 24 is on the inability of the other gods to predict the future and to explain the past. these other gods can't do it. Why? They can't even talk. I mean, that's just obvious. So the Lord, through Isaiah, challenged all of these idolaters to prove that their gods were truly deities. And the Lord presented himself as the king of Jacob. From the nation's perspective, they said, "Oh, king of Jacob." Well, shoot, that's nothing more than just a national god among all the people groups had their own gods, but really and truly, he was the King of Kings. So it says, declare the things coming afterward, so that we may know what you are, so that we may know that you are gods. I think he's doing a little Babylon B here, talking to these idols and the idolaters. Indeed, do good or do evil, so we may all see and be awestruck. Behold, you are nothing, and your work is null. Whoever chooses you is loathsome. So, since these challenges, they go answered, these idols, they can't reply. So the Lord judges the idols as nothing, and their supposed works, they're amount to nothing. And the people that worship them, they're an abomination. Because why? They follow such non-entities, and because they do so because they're following these voiceless, mindless, powerless gods, then the people themselves become just like their gods, with no real voice, no minds, no power at all. So whoever chooses to follow these gods are foolish. So, so the idea of a polytheistic idolatry, as bad as it is it's maybe not abominable in its own, but it's really the act of replacing the truth with the idolatry system is what is abominable. All right, so verse 25. I have stirred up one from the north, and he has come from the rising of the sun. He will call upon my name. He will trample rulers as on mortar, like a potter treading clay. So verses 21 to 24, they recorded the Lord's challenge to the idols. And now verses 25 to 29 record his sentence on them. In contrast to the idols, the Lord predicted that he would raise up from the northeast one who would serve him. Exactly what God would do is not revealed here right now, except that this individual would dominate all of his enemies. The emphasis in verse 25 to 29 is on God's ability to predict this man's appearance ahead of time. So the Lord, in contrast to these idols, claimed that he would do something in the future and predicted what it would be. And he would bring out a conqueror from the north who wasn't even in existence. The Persian Empire was not anywhere on the horizon at that point. And so this individual that he's talking about would actually be proved to be Cyrus the Persian, or Cyrus the Great, and he originated, of course, in the east and the north, in reference east and north in reference to Israel, and he would call on the Lord's name, in that he would proclaim the reputation of the Lord by fulfilling his prophecy. So he didn't worship God exclusively, but he acknowledged the greatness of God, and that he would his works, the things that he did, were a direct fulfillment of what God said that he would do. And I thought about the picture. I don't know if you've ever seen anything like this, where it says, where he's talking about trample rulers as on mortar, like a potter treading clay. And so you'll notice that this guy here there's a pattern to his treading of the clay. It's not just a random stomping the grapes kind of thing like Lucy and whatever Lucy's pal there. I can't ever think of her name. Ethel, was that her name? I can't remember. Lucy,
Ethel.
Ethel. Okay, that's it. So if you recall that episode of the two of them are stomping grapes with their feet. Well, this guy's doing that, but he's in a pattern, and so there again, the Lord is saying, I'm going to Cyrus is going to come through here, and he's going to just destroy everybody, not haphazardly. Boy, it's going to be methodical, and it's going to be very, very effective. But this guy here is mixing up clay. They put the water and the clay in there, and he's mixing it up with his feet. And then they take that to the wheel, and then they can turn it into pottery. But I don't know if any of you have ever seen a guy stomping, treading clay, and so I got that picture for you. So
they're doing that now in this day and age?
yes, in some part. That was in Tunisia today. Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's today or maybe yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
well,
but yeah, there are places in the
2023.
yeah, there are places in the world where they still do that sort of thing. I've actually seen them people drilling oil wells in Malaysia and Indonesia by hand with a drill, and they have a pole through the top of it, of the drill bit, and they just walk around as the pole goes down, and they keep adding to it, and they just keep on walking around, and they drill an oil well that way because the oil is so shallow. If it was, they couldn't do it if the oil wasn't so deep. But when I was working in Venezuela on the Orinoco River, we were at a base camp there, and we tried to drill a water well. After several attempts, and the last one, we hit oil at 15 feet. We had to barge our water in because we just couldn't do it. So anyway, yeah, that stuff still goes on. Verse 26, who told this from the beginning so that we may know, or from former times so we may say he is right? In fact, no one foretold it. In fact, no one announced it. In fact, no one heard your words. So the Lord was the only predictor of Cyrus, and his prediction proves that he's unique among the gods. In Israel's day, the pagans claimed that their God sent them messages, like that. But these messages were vague and they weren't specific. And so the fulfillment of this prediction would really prove that the Lord was the one true God. Now, there are scholars that believe that the writer of this part of Isaiah, if not the whole book, lived after Cyrus began his conquest, or somewhere around 545 BC, something like that. But if that were so, then the whole point of this passage loses all of its force. That the Lord can not only, predict the future, but he can bring it to pass. So anytime, I run into it quite often where, there are scholars, these theologians, these scholars, that they just can't force themselves. They can't bring themselves to the point that that the Lord is really an all-powerful thing. And so they always try to somehow explain away the miraculous. And so that kind of aggravates me when they do that. All right, verse 27. First it was to Zion, behold, here they are, and to Jerusalem, I will give a herald of good news. The Lord had announced to his people that Cyrus's invaders would come. Cyrus would be a messenger of good news in two senses. Here, of course, he's a conqueror, but his coming would first validate the truthfulness of Isaiah's prediction of his coming. And then his coming would also mean what? The return from captivity of the Jewish exiles, because he took over from he conquered the Babylonians, and then he said, okay, all you guys, the Jewish people, you can go back home, because he recognized the greatness of Israel's God. So finally, verses 28 and 29. When I look, there is no one, there is no counselor among them. When I ask them, they have no response. Indeed, they are all a delusion. Their works are null. Their molten images are wind and waste. So when the Lord looked around for a messenger from these other gods, he said, hey, send me somebody who predicted. Has anybody else predicted Cyrus coming? Yeah, he could find no one. Not one of them could get any information about his coming. And so he concluded that just like he had begun, but this time he's passing judgment on the idolaters rather than on the idols themselves. He said, behold, again, there's a behold there, ends each of these subsections. The idolaters are false in the sense of being untrue and delusive, and their works, the idols themselves, are worthless, and their idol images amount to nothing. So anyway, that ends the chapter. And are there any comments or questions before we shut everything down? I will go ahead and undo the